So tonight we're going to be looking, as we continue in the character section of the book of Daniel, and looking at different individual examples of character in a foreign land when the world was against them. We're going to be looking tonight at Daniel in the lion's den. So as we look at Daniel in the lion's den, our primary chapter is going to be Daniel chapter 6. So if you're turning in your Bible, that's the section we'll be hanging out in. One of the things that particularly stands out, I think, in this case of Daniel is in most Hollywood productions, when they're going to have a leading man and he's going to be the hero, what are the things that you typically see in the hero leading man of a movie nowadays? He's going to be good looking. He's going to be what else? Probably going to be strong. Okay, well, sometimes he may be a guy of bad character. That's true. Hollywood doesn't always shine morality, for sure. He's typically not going to be an older man either, right? And if he is an older man, in real life, they're going to try and make him look younger through digital effects or lots of makeup or something. Daniel flips the script on that, because in Daniel chapter 6, we're looking at the hero of the story being a guy who's probably around 80 or so. He's an older man. By the time we get to Daniel chapter 6, Daniel is not the young, good-looking guy that came to captivity. He's now a man who has served for many years under Nebuchadnezzar. But by the end of Daniel chapter 5, there has been a changing of the guard from the Chaldeans to now the Medes and the Persians. And the man who's in charge is Darius. And so if you start doing the math of the general age at which Daniel arrived, and then the time period by the time Darius is ruling over the city of Babylon, you put him in the 80s range. That's a good general rule of thumb. And so what I like about that is that the Bible leaves room for heroes of every era. And one of the things that always amazes me about Moses is that particular detail. Moses was useless till he was 80. And you want to think about everything that we know about Moses, everything that when we think about Moses and all the good he did, it didn't start till after 80 years of whoopings. I mean, that's what it took, right? It took that long for him to become the guy who would lead the children of Israel out of Egypt. So Daniel is that as well, in that by the time we get to chapter 6, he's not the young man who stood up in faith, although we've seen that already too. But he's a guy at the other end of life who doesn't have the physique of a young man, doesn't have that outward appearance that makes you go, I really want to follow this guy. For all we know, he kind of hobbled around a little bit as you slow down with age. He gets that little stoop to his back. Certainly would have had some wrinkles. As far as we can tell, he had a pretty clear mind, which was a gift. But the fact is that he is, as you envision this story, don't envision a young man. Envision an older man. As we look at Daniel and the story of Daniel in the lion's den, you have various elements, right? We have the lions. We have the king at the time. What's his name? Daniel chapter 6. It's an open book test. Darius. Yes, Darius. And so Darius means Lord. And we don't know for sure, but it was likely a royal name that was given, or a title, for Astyages, who was the last king of the Medes. That would not have been a surprising thing for Darius to be a title that he used in that sense. So as they try and place what king exactly this was, it is probably Astyages, which is a lot harder to say than Darius. So, as you look at, you've got Darius, you've got the lions, you've got Daniel. Who else are the key players in this? So far, we don't have any bad guys, do we? Unless you're going to count the lions, which I think is really rude. Who are the bad guys? Yep. Satraps, the other guys who are in that position of being jealous of him, right? Daniel is in the position of being over the three commissioners. Chapter 6, verse 1, it seemed good to Darius to appoint 120 satraps over the kingdom, that they would be in charge of the whole kingdom, and over them 3 commissioners, of whom Daniel was one. Then you go down to verse 3, and it says, then this Daniel began distinguishing himself among the commissioners and satraps because he possessed an extraordinary spirit. And the king planned to appoint him over the entire kingdom. So the bad guys become all these other ones who were jealous of who he was. As you look at Daniel chapter 6 is the culmination of a very long life of service. Daniel did not just wake up one day and Darius say, I think I want to put this guy over the entire kingdom. It was a culmination of a lot of hard work over time, where people saw, Darius especially, that this guy's trustworthy. He's somebody who's consistent. He's somebody who works hard. He's somebody who has the characteristics of being honest. The work ethic, the wisdom, all of those things bore themselves out over time. All the characteristics that make you want to put somebody in a position of authority do not show up over the course of one day. All the characteristics that point towards leadership are long-term characteristics. In the church, we have a great example of this. Who are the leaders in the church? It's the elders, right? What does elder mean? Old, right? And there's a reason for that. I really like to emphasize that with elders, by the way, that you have been biblically deemed an older person. So you can't hide from it anymore, Scott. It is what it is. And but there's a reason for that. And in the New Testament, when we talk about the qualification for elders, what's the risk that we're given in the New Testament if you take a young guy who's a novice and you put him in that position of being either an elder, or it even talks about it in the position of being a deacon? What's going to happen? He's going to have no experience, so he's going to make bad choices. What are some other things that could happen? What? He can get puffed up and arrogant. The position and the title and everything can go to his head. Whereas, by the time you are an older man and you've lived through some things, you are less likely to get puffed up, because what do you learn typically through life every time you start to get proud? The fall is coming, right? You know you're going to get your legs taken out from underneath you. So the reason I mention all of this is Daniel doesn't get to be this hero that we see. We're going to look at one event. We're going to look at a moment in time in Daniel's life where he has to make a decision and stand up for what he believes. But that situation does not happen if Daniel doesn't live the way he does every day to be somebody that leadership just exudes from him. And the text says that because in verse 3, what does it say that he possessed? An excellent spirit. That's right. Some of your versions might say an extraordinary spirit. Anybody have any other translations? Excellent spirit, extraordinary spirit. Anybody else have any other translations? I remember if I read there were one or two other, they all give the same sense. But that idea of he stood out. You know, extraordinary is a great word for that because it's two words slammed together. It's ordinary and then what? Let's put extra on the front. So there's everybody else who's ordinary and he's just got a little bit extra. He works a little bit harder than everybody else. He's a little bit more trustworthy than everybody else. Just a little extra of everything, right? And you see that over time with Daniel. In Proverbs 22, verse 29, now, Proverbs is full of all of these wisdom ideas. It says, do you see a man skilled in his work? He will stand before kings. He will not stand before obscure men. I love that proverb because it points to this just simple idea that if you do whatever you do it the best you can, which in the New Testament we have that idea echoed, don't we? What are we told to do? Whatever you do it as for who? Do it as for the Lord, right? So, if you're a carpenter, you make the best furniture. If you are a businessman or an accountant, you make sure the books are extra accurate. Remember there's an accountant I knew years ago, and he, you know how if you get, like you're reconciling the books or managing your budget and you find you're off $1 or something like that? Most of us would just go, well, the buck went somewhere, and he just fixed it. This guy tore his office apart over 15 cents. Just tore it apart because that 15 cents drove him nuts because he had to find where the accounting error was because as an accountant, it was in his character to be specific and careful with that. Now, the 15 cents doesn't matter, does it? But if you're going to go and hire an accountant, which accountant do you want? The guy who just goes, there's some discrepancies, just make an adjustment. Or the guy who tears his office apart over 15 cents. Fair point. Yeah, as long as he doesn't charge you for that. But you want that level of care, right? You want the person who'll go the extra mile in whatever it is that they're doing. And Daniel is that kind of guy. And Proverbs 22 says, if you see a man who's skilled in his work, he's going to stand before kings. And Daniel is a perfect example of that. So Daniel's success leads to promotion. And as he is promoted, what happens to all the surrounding people? It's immediately followed by jealousy, right? Is that avoidable? No. I don't think it's if Daniel couldn't avoid it, I'm going to go out on a limb and say that we can't either. Right? If Daniel, with all of his character and humility and all these sorts of things, as he had this extraordinary spirit and showed skill and diligence, if he ran into people who were jealous of him because of that, I don't think that any of the rest of us can avoid it. You can look at Moses. Moses is going to fit into that same category as well, right? Moses is the only person recorded in the Bible as saying who was the most humble man on the earth. And so there's nobody more humble than Moses. So as he is in this position of great authority over Israel, did he ever face jealousy? Yeah, absolutely. Who were people who were jealous of him? His siblings were, right? So Miriam and Aaron were. Anybody else? Remember the whole ground splitting open? Who did it swallow? Who was it? Ever remember? The ground split up and it was the rebellion of who? Korah, yeah. See, some of you are saying it quiet, but you're muffled, and I'm not as good at hearing as I should be. So, if you know the answer, I need you to speak up, just for me. Otherwise, I got to get one of those big ear horn things, and that doesn't look good on camera. So, Daniel's success leads to promotion, which is followed by jealousy, which tells us that if we're going to do God's will and be skilled in our work and serve God the way we are, we're going to run into jealousy. This is just going to be part of your life as a Christian. If you're going to live and serve that way, you're going to have to accept that there will be people who don't like you simply because you're good at your job, because you are well liked, because you're honest. And so they're going to start gunning for you. So as they begin to gun for Daniel, and we get down to about verse 4 and 5, and they look for a way to accuse him, what does the scripture say about the subject? They're looking for a way to accuse Daniel so they can knock him down a few pegs. What's the problem they run into? They can find nothing they can accuse him of until they finally say, if we're going to accuse him of anything, it's going to be against him with his God. The only time that this guy ever seems to not do his fullest to serve Darius is if serving Darius conflicts with serving Jehovah. May that be said of all of us. I mean, wouldn't that be wonderful if the only time you were known for being less than the best employee, or less than the best friend, or less than the best neighbor was when your relationship with work or friends or whoever came in conflict with your relationship with God? Could you not in many ways just say that's the goal in life? Is to be the best at every relationship unless a more important relationship comes in conflict with it. Right? I mean, you should be really good at your job, but then what if your job is impacting your marriage in a negative way? Should you choose your job or your marriage? Because when we put it that way, it becomes really simple, right? I was like, of course you choose your marriage, you dummy. But how many times do you see people, and men especially, choose their job over their marriage? I mean, it just happens all the time. Honey, I got to work. And we use that as an excuse. How many times do people use our relationships with human beings as an excuse to be less than diligent in our relationship with God? Right? I mean, all of these things happen. What makes Daniel different is that he doesn't let it happen. And so when you look at Daniel, one of the things that we see is that as that jealousy increases, they're gunning for him. And if there had been anything corrupt in him, they would have found it. Now you can see this very clearly today in American politics. If you are a politician and you start rising in the ranks and there's a skeleton in your closet and then all of a sudden the groups turn against you, what's going to happen to the skeleton? It comes out of the closet. In fact, they're finding more and more that as soon as somebody starts to run for president, there's a whole team that the other side, that's all they're doing is they're trying to find the dirt. And then they say, wait for the right moment to bring that dirt out. Have you ever noticed that it's always at the most inopportune times and campaigns that the dirty laundry of the guys come out? That's not an accident. There's a whole team of people back there going, okay, right when it's about time for people to vote, we need to make sure that they know wham. So the only way you can avoid that is to not have a skeleton in the closet. You can't cut any corners. You're not allowed to cheat. Now, do you think any of those commissioners and satraps ever cheated? They ever broke the rules or cut some corners or, maybe did some favors for their friends? Passed a permit that didn't need to be? Of course they did, right? But that's not fair, is it? If Daniel had done that, what happens? Yeah, they would have exposed him right away. They would have ganged up and they would have said, that's it. Look at this thing that he did, even though the rest of them were doing it. That's not fair. What do we tell our kids? That's right. That's what we tell our kids. Life's not fair. Get over it. If you're going to be a Christian, life's not going to be fair. Satan doesn't play clean. He plays dirty. And that's exactly what's going on here with Daniel. They're playing dirty. And so they are looking for any sort of corruption. I like when we're talking about being somebody who cannot be corrupted. I like the language of the elder qualifications. And it says above reproach. The elder is to be above reproach. And that comes from the idea of not giving anything to grab hold of. Somebody who's above reproach, you know how like you go on a roller coaster and they always walk by and make sure you got all your clothes tucked into the car? You know, they want to make sure you don't have anything dangling out the edge of the roller coaster. Why are they doing that? Yeah, all it takes is just one little thing to get caught and, physics, right? That's the idea of an elder being above reproach is don't leave anything hanging out there that somebody could accuse you of. This is why we talk about things like, maybe the local bar has the best hamburger, but who cares? You know what I mean? If you and I have to forgo some things to stay above reproach so that we don't even give a hint of evil or corruption, I think that's worth it. Because you know full well, if Daniel gave even a hint of those sorts of things, they would have been all over him. And so we've got to think about not just what is right, but then also doing those things that are right in the sight of all men and just avoiding any sort of appearance of evil. I think that goes along with that idea of being above reproach. I have on the worksheet corruption. If you're looking for the definition of it, it's dishonest or fraudulent conduct, typically involving bribery. A corrupt person is somebody who has a price. So what are some examples of corruption that we see in leadership in the world today? Whether it be in business or in politics or, even in the family environment. Husbands and wives are leaders in their homes. What are forms of corruption? Embezzlement. Yeah, that we just take a little bit of money off the top, right? Cook the books a little bit. What? Tax fraud. Yeah, absolutely. Just generically lying whenever it just makes life easier to just not tell the truth. Yeah. Any other examples? I'll bring up one in parenting. How about favoritism in parenting? Would we call that I think we could call that a form of corruption. Right? If we show favoritism towards one child over another, certain kids get punished, other kids don't. We know of examples in the Bible with that.
Well, I could point out something that might not be corruption in the legal sense if you're arrested, but still corruption nonetheless, corruption moral. Our politicians in this country, for example, want to make certain lifestyles and certain things acceptable and normal. Next month, the month is Pride Month. For example, the word pride itself used to be considered a sin. Prideful. Yet they want to normalize it. That's corrupting. Corrupting our youth. Same thing they push into our schools. They force our kids to recite. Corrupting. Changing their morals. Might not be illegal, but certainly immoral.
Yep, absolutely. And there's a lot of things like that. I mean, you could talk about like slander. How easy is it? I mean, you go back to getting ahead, like you were talking about lying to get ahead in the workplace. How about slandering the other guy you work with? You won't get fired over that per se. It's not legally wrong, but it's corruption. And yes, moral corruption, which is seen all over in all sorts of circumstances, including the ones that you have mentioned, that is a form of conduct that is not befitting leadership. Yeah.
And the thing is about truth. Truth doesn't need propaganda.
Mm-hmm.
A lie not only needs to be propagandized, but they need to slander the truth. Because if something's good, something works in business, for example, people want to buy it. It doesn't work. They want the product. Apple doesn't have to come out there and keep, telling people that our product works. People want it and they line up down the street to get it. whereas some of these other lifestyles don't work. They have to push routinely as not only normal, but sometimes preferred.
Well, you get to calling good evil and evil good, for sure. There's no doubt about it. Okay, so the opposite then, Proverbs 22:11 talks about the opposite of corruption, and it is purity. So as we're looking at Daniel, you're looking at somebody who had purified his life, and he has pure character. And so the only thing they can accuse him of is based off of the purity of his character. He will choose God. In fact, they have a level of confidence there that their whole scheme depends on. The irony of this scheme that they have, which is what? What's the scheme? What's the plan? Right. So he's going to make a rule that says the only one you can make any petition to, which prayer is petition, is just the king, and we're going to do it for 30 days. Now that whole thing is created for the purpose of bringing down Daniel. It only works if Daniel is consistent. Right? So if Daniel's like them, this plan is a nothing. So Daniel has to be so pure of character that even his enemies know what he's going to do before he's going to do it. There is a level of consistency that the Scripture points towards in godliness that I think is really, really important. When you look at God's pattern, if we're living by God's pattern, what's the whole point of a pattern? When I talk about a pattern, say, do you see the pattern? What am I saying? What's pattern mean? Yeah, repetition. It's like it's something that like if you hear the pattern, so if there's like a knocking on the wall and you hear, somebody has to do it, complete it, right? You hear the pattern, and so you know the way that it goes, right? If you see the pattern, like if you have like a quilt and there's going to be a pattern, you can see how it replicates itself. All of Christianity is just simply following the New Testament pattern, which means if we're doing it right, our friends and our foes alike should be able to look at the New Testament and say, I know how they'll handle this. In fact, if we're doing it right, the devil should know exactly what we're going to do next if our character is consistent to the New Testament pattern. And that's what we see with Daniel. They know the kind of guy that Daniel is, and they know the purity of his character, and so they build this whole plan to put him in a position of conflict. And if you look at the back side of the worksheet, the top line I have there is, pure character is not a guarantee of avoiding conflict. Instead, it is a guarantee of it. When you have purity of character, you are not going to avoid conflict, you are going to get it. You are inviting it. The only way to truly avoid conflict in life is to change yourself to whatever circumstance you're in to keep those people in that moment happy. For example, if you want to avoid conflict on Sunday, you have your Sunday behavior around Christians, and then you go to work and they're telling dirty jokes and off-color things, and you just join in that, and you just kind of assimilate to that environment. And then you're out with friends, and they act a different way, and depending on which friend it is, you just assimilate to that. That's the way to avoid conflict. And isn't that exactly the way our world is teaching us to be? I mean, just avoid conflict in every way. Just be, in fact, we could take it and almost make it sound biblical. Just be all things to all men. Just fit in. Don't make waves. Be politically correct. All of these things are just different ways of saying, don't get into a situation of conflict by just adjusting yourself to people. Now, biblically, should we adjust ourselves to people? It's a trick question. Yes, right? And then somebody else says, sometimes. That's the right answer, isn't it? When in Rome, you eat what the Romans eat. But you don't adjust so much that you become Roman in debauchery, right? There's a limit and a line to that. And the thing with maturity as Christians is learning where that line is. And that line is whenever it's going to come in conflict with the character that God has assigned for us to have. So in Matthew chapter 10, this is why Jesus talks about confessing me before men. And he says it's such a big deal because if you'll confess him before men, who will he confess you before? Father in heaven. It's kind of a big deal, right? Can you imagine we die and the judgment day comes and you see Jesus and Jesus is standing right next to his Father and you walk up, it's your turn in the line of judgment, and Jesus looks at you and then says, I don't know that guy. I mean, that's denial, right? That's what Peter did. That's Peter's denial. I don't know that man. That's a huge problem for us if Jesus denies you before his Father. So you and I, we have to confess him before men if we wish for him to confess us before his Father. And then at the very end of that, in Matthew 10, 32 through 34, he talks about confessing and then denying. And then at the very end, he says, do not think that I came to bring peace on the earth. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword. Why do you think those two things are combined? Confessing and denying are put right next to, I didn't come to bring peace, but a sword. What's the connection? It's going to, right? It's going to cause that friction. It's a guarantee. Because the moment you confess Jesus, because when we talk about confessing Jesus, we're not just saying his name. What are we confessing? What's the confession of Jesus? He's the Son of the living God. That's right. So that confession is a statement of truth, which is what you were getting at, right? That there are some things that are just true. And if I'm going to make a statement that that's true, then by default, everything else is false. And so you are now creating a point of friction. And that's not an easy thing to deal with in life. In life, most of the time, we don't like to have friction with people. Most people like to get along with other people. But Daniel has to draw a line of, I will get along, but only so far. So they make the edict. Darius signs the document down in verse 9. And then in verse 10, when Daniel knew that the document was signed, he entered his house. Now in his roof chamber, he had windows open toward Jerusalem, and he continued kneeling on his knees 3 times a day, praying and giving thanks before his God, as he had been doing previously. If there's no other verse that we pay any attention to in this chapter, this is the verse. This is the key to the whole thing. What's so powerful about Daniel praying here? What? Continuous obedience, is that what you said? I'm sorry. Yeah, he's being disobedient to the law. But he's being disobedient by being the same. Right? So he's both things, right? So the law changes, but he doesn't change, which by default also means we got to go back. What was he doing? He's 80 now. What's he been doing for the last 10, 20, 30, whatever years, right? He's been doing this. Yeah.
What he's doing also is commanded.
Correct.
He's not commanded to pray 3 times a day.
No.
But it's his habit.
Yep.
It's what he does for God.
Mm-hmm.
Now there's a short-term, 30-day or less, edict by a king, by ruling authority. Don't worship.
Mm-hmm.
Don't do what you've been doing.
Yep.
And if he does that, he could say, I'm preserving my life.
Mm-hmm.
I'm elongating my life. Just 30 days. Give it up for 30 days. Keep it private, keep it at home, shut the windows, whatever. Follow what the government's telling me to do. Because it wasn't required by God.
Correct. Yeah, it would be very easy for him to just simply say, I'll take a 30-day moratorium on this habit.
But he continued to do it.
Absolutely.
Peril of death.
Yep, absolutely. And his enemies figured that's what he was going to do, right? Like that's the whole purpose. Their goal is not to get him to stop praying for 30 days. The commissioners and the satraps are not saying, boy, well, let's make this rule in here so that Daniel will stop praying for 30 days. That's not what they wanted. They want Daniel gone. So they're counting on that type of behavior. Couple of things to think about here with Daniel is, I imagine Daniel's a pretty busy guy. Is that fair to say that at this stage of his life and in this point in his career, he's a pretty busy guy? He's over the entire kingdom almost. He's one of the three guys that is split amongst, and he's risen to a position of prominence there. And yet Daniel is stopping to pray 3 times a day. And he's going back from whatever meetings he's having, going back to his room to go and 3 times a day pray. Something for all of us to consider is, I don't think I'm any busier than Daniel. But to set aside openly 3 times a day where I stop everything I'm doing, and not just, we're not talking about it was a time to eat a meal, so he stopped to say thank you for the food. But I mean, stop everything you're doing for just the purpose of praying. I can't say that's a habit of mine. I mean, I'd like to say it is, but it isn't. And I don't think I'm any busier than him. So there's a lesson there, I think, in Daniel that as he's been climbing the ranks, I mean, a lot of times that's what we say is, I'll get to these things once I'm done being busy. As he is busy all the time, he kind of flips it on his head. He's like, I'm so busy, I can't imagine having, not handling this with 3 times a day of prayer. So there's a difference of mentality there. So he keeps up that routine, and that protest, that routine is his protest, right? He says, I'm going to keep being the exact same guy that I am every day. Also there in verse 10, when he's praying, what does it say he's doing? What was that? Towards the open window. Yes, he's praying towards the open window, towards Jerusalem. And so that would match what you would see like Solomon saying at the dedication of the temple. He says that when we pray towards this place that you would hear our petition. So it's openly, while facing Jerusalem, that it's openly a prayer towards Jehovah and not Darius, right? And it says he's praying, the window's open, he's facing toward Jerusalem. He's continually kneeling on his knees 3 times a day. He's praying, and there's one other thing he's doing. Giving thanks, which matches what our New Testament says. When you pray, what's the one thing you're always told to include with prayer? Giving thanks, right? So all of this is there. Another thing that I think is interesting is Daniel is here. He knows the document's been signed. He knows he's at risk. Even if I went in and continued praying, as was my routine, I could see how I might forget to give thanks that time. Because I know that I'm praying with the knife to my throat. But Daniel doesn't forget to give thanks, even in a time of great tribulation. Daniel does this, and Darius, it is brought to his attention by who? Yeah, by all those jealous people, right? Yeah, they very quickly bring us his attention. And so Darius is not happy about it, right? So what's Darius's feeling about all of this? Yeah. Uh-oh, my mistake, right? He made an error. He got tricked into this. He got cornered into it. I didn't realize the implications of what he was doing. But he's bound by the rule, because the rule is that you can't revoke a law once you do it. There's some things, I think, that can be learned just in the fact of when you live in the world and there are people who become jealous of you because you serve the Lord, and by extension you serve others and do things to the best of your ability, you will get a good reputation with those you are working for. And we have a lot of examples of people who served others and got a good reputation for it. Right? Daniel's one of them, but who are other people who served under leaders that then received a good recommendation for it? Yeah, Joseph is a huge one, right? And so the guy above thinks highly of him, but his hands are tied, and so he throws him into the lion's den, but he doesn't enjoy it. In other words, it's a painful thing for him. You notice, as we've been going through this class, the thing I've spent the least amount of time on is the part that gets most of the attention, right? Which is what? What's the thing that we all get excited about with Daniel? Yeah, the angel comes in and shuts the mouth of the lion. But I haven't focused on that because you already know that part of the story, right? That's the part you know. But just like when we talked about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, it's all the stuff that leads up to the fiery furnace that's so impressive. It's all the stuff that leads up to him being in the lion's den that's so impressive. Imagine for a second that God didn't send an angel to shut the mouth of the lions. Would not the answer be the same as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? Like, my God can stop the mouth of these lions, but whether he will or not, I don't know. But either way, I'm going to pray. Right? Daniel didn't know ahead of time that was what was going to happen. He just served God. And so that unknown element is still there. But when Daniel is delivered, immediately he glorified God for his redemption, which is the other side of that story. Because when Daniel makes it through the night, which by the way is quite a big deal with lions. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on it, but lions are one of the few animals that are documented as getting a taste for people. Like they are documented for actually getting a hunger for human flesh. Most animals are not interested in eating people, but lions are one of the few where that can happen. If you want to look it up, there's the man-eaters of Savo. They made a movie out of it years ago called Ghost in the Darkness, but they were these lionesses that tasted people and then began to hunt them. And that's one of the reasons they would use lions, is because a lot of times other animals would not be interested. But these are hungry lions. They're in the pit. They're left with, and so they would normally just devour. And we know that to be the case on top of it because after Daniel's freed from the lion's den, what happens next? What? Payback. Yeah, payback. Yeah, Darius throws all of those guys in there and they immediately devour them. They don't even hit the ground before things go bad. But as we look at Daniel, when he was saved, he immediately gives God credit for it. And if you look in Daniel chapter 6, down in verse 20, and I know we're at time here, so we'll stop here. It says, when he, that is Darius, had come near the den to Daniel, he cried out with a troubled voice. The king spoke and he said to Daniel, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you constantly serve, been able to deliver you from the lions? Notice the language of Darius. He says, your God, so he doesn't own him as his God, but he just says, your God, and then he says, you serve him, and what's the way he describes Daniel's service to God? Constantly. You constantly serve. Has he saved you? That, I think, is the overriding message of Daniel in the lion's den. Meditate on and think on it yourself, but as I look at the story of Daniel in the lion's den, I think that the most powerful theme of it is a lifetime of constant service, culminating in this. Daniel is not the kind of guy who's going to change. His enemies know it. All they got to do is change the rule, and hopefully they'll get him. But in reality, it's that constant routine service to God that matters. And the problem with routine is it doesn't feel like it's doing anything most of the time. So when we're doing our regular Bible reading, when we're praying regularly, each individual act doesn't feel like it's doing anything, but it's the routine itself that makes the big difference. And Daniel was a constant routine servant. Does anybody have any comments or questions there? Yes?
The thing is about routine and habits, they happen without thought. It says in verse 10, he knew that law was signed. And it's more than just habit. Habit you might, sit to eat your meal, give thanks. And not even consciously think about it.
Yep.
But he went up to the upper window, opened it up, consciously.
Yeah, I would argue it was habit, but not by rote, right? It is a routine he built, and he knew the document was signed, and he could easily have broken that routine, but it was a conscious choice not to break it. Absolutely. So it isn't mindless. Which I think is what you're getting at, right? It wasn't a mindless thing. It's a routine that he had built over time consciously. Any other comments or questions? Okay, then we'll close down there. And next week we'll look at Daniel's prayer for the nation.